0006. Inside a hollowed-out moon at the far edge of the Veshon drift sits a chamber that was, for 4,000 years, the most feared room in the galaxy. No throne, no scripture, no defense. For 40 centuries, every species that reached the stars was summoned to that chamber and made to explain its god. Those who answered well were granted trade. Those who answered poorly were ranked, recorded, and quietly diminished. The chamber never raised a weapon. It never had to. This is the real account of what happened the day humanity was finally invited inside. We are the Veho Corps. We are the keepers of the record. We have written down every hearing held inside the hollow cathedral of Tessarvin since the first ceremony was performed under 3 moons that no longer exist. We were not parties to the judgments. We were only the scribes. But on the day the humans arrived, we found that we could no longer keep our distance from what we were writing. This is the account we owe to the chamber, and to ourselves, and to the strange small people who walked into it with a kettle. To understand what happened, you have to understand the galaxy as it stood before the humans came. The concord of certain faiths was older than written language in most of the species it governed. It had been founded by 7 civilizations whose names, in their own tongues, all translated roughly to the same idea: those who knew. They had achieved space travel first. They had cataloged the cosmologies of the species who came after them. And somewhere in their long memory, they had decided that the gods a species worshipped were the truest measure of that species' worth. The system was elegant in the way that quiet cruelties often are. A new species would reach the stars. The conquered would extend an invitation. The new species would travel to the hollow cathedral, be seated before the 7 inquisitors, and be asked to describe what they believed. The inquisitors would listen. They would consult their taxonomy. They would assign a rank. And from that rank everything followed. How many trade routes the new species could use, how many votes they held in the Assembly of Worlds, how much of their own home system they were permitted to claim. The conquered did not need armies. It had bureaucracy and it had certainty, and in the long quiet of the galactic record, those 2 things had proven sufficient. Some species had answered well. The Yantu of the Pale Belt had described their god as a mathematical proof and had been ranked 3rd. The Halen of Ve had described theirs as a great migrating beast and had been ranked 7th. Some had answered badly. The Eshkaran had refused to answer at all and had been ranked at the bottom of the taxonomy, where they remained for 6 centuries until their last colony failed and their name was struck from the rolls. The cathedral had a memory. It did not forget the species that had insulted it. In all those 40 centuries, no one had ever broken the ritual. Some had wept during it. Some had begged. Some had argued and shouted and torn their ceremonial garments. But every species that entered the chamber had played the chamber's game. They had defended a god. They had submitted to a rank. That was simply what was done. We had recorded it all. We had filed each transcript in the great vaulted archive at the moon's core, where the air was kept cold and the parchment was kept dry, and where, on certain anniversaries, we lit small oil lamps for the species that no longer existed. The humans were noticed late. This is a thing we are not proud of. By the time the conquered turned its attention to them, they had already been spacefaring for over 2 centuries, had established colonies in 4 neighboring systems, and had developed the curious habit of sending medical ships into disputed territories without asking permission. They were small in stature. They were short-lived, even by the standards of the younger species. Their homeworld was unremarkable. Our early observers filed reports that described them as agriculturally competent and emotionally unstable, which is the phrase our taxonomy uses for any species that cries at music. We assumed they would be easy to categorize. But the reports kept arriving, and the reports kept being strange. The humans buried their dead in the ground and planted trees over them. The humans had thousands of gods and no gods and one god, and the same human family might hold all 3 positions across 3 generations without anyone considering this unusual. The humans had a custom, observed in nearly every culture on their planet, of feeding strangers. Not allies, not kin, strangers. The observers had noted this with confusion. Our taxonomy had no entry for it. We filed the observation under miscellaneous and moved on. There was also the matter of the coffee shops. Our long-range cultural surveys had recorded that humans, when they wished to discuss matters of ultimate concern, did so most often in small public establishments where a brewed beverage was served. They did not argue about their gods in temples. They argued about their gods over cups, with strangers, while a third party they had never met sat nearby and listened. This had been noted by observer Corvin Hess, who had retired shortly after submitting his report and had not been heard from since. We understand now that he had begun, even then, to suspect. The decision to invite humanity to the cathedral was made in the standard way, which is to say it was made by the conquered without consultation and announced as a formality. The invitation was transmitted on a tight beam to the human capital on Earth, written in the ceremonial language of the Inquisitors, and accompanied by the standard list of protocols. Arrive within the lunar cycle, bring 3 emissaries no more, bring your sacred texts, prepare to defend your cosmology. We expected a delegation of 7 because every species sent 7, even though the protocol said 3. We expected scripture in heavy bindings. We expected the usual. Humanity sent 2 people, 2. We checked the manifest 3 times. The first was a woman named Eliza Marwin, 61 years old, born in the small mountainous country of Wales, retired from a profession her file described as hospice chaplaincy. We did not know what hospice chaplaincy was. Our translators rendered it as one who sits with the dying. We assumed this was a metaphor. It was not. The second was a man named Tomás Beltrán, 44 years old, born in the highlands of Bolivia, profession listed as xenolinguist. He had been chosen, the human transmission explained, because he was the only person on Earth who could pronounce the Inquisitor's ceremonial language without giving offense. The human transmission also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Eliza Marwin had requested permission to bring 1 small wooden box. Permission was granted. We assumed the box contained scripture. The hollow cathedral was prepared in the usual manner. The benches were swept. The 7 Inquisitor perches, each carved from the bone of a different extinct beast, were polished. The great central floor, 14 meters across and worn smooth by 10,000 civilizations, was washed and dried. The acoustics were checked. The recording crystals were aligned. We took our places at the scribe's alcove, our pens ready, our taxonomy open on the lectern beside us. We had performed this ritual 631 times in our personal service. We had no reason to expect that the 632nd would be different. The Inquisitors entered first. They always did. 7 of them, in the order their species had joined the conquered, each robed in the colors of their original homeworld. The eldest, Vascorlin of the 2, was over 900 years old and had presided over the chamber for the last 3 centuries. He took his perch slowly, as he always did, and the others followed. The chamber settled into the deep silence that preceded every hearing. We dipped our pens. The great door opened. Eliza Marwin walked in first. She was small. We had been told humans were small, but seeing her in the chamber against the scale of the perches and the vaulted ceiling and the cold stone benches was something else. She walked with the slight stiffness of an aging body. She wore plain clothing, gray and brown, with no ceremonial markings of any kind. She carried in both hands a wooden box about the size of a 2-prayer stone. Behind her came Tomás Beltrán, taller, dark-haired, carrying nothing but a folded cloth draped over his arm. He looked around the chamber once slowly, taking in the ceiling and the perches and the worn floor, and then he looked at Eliza, and Eliza nodded. They reached the center of the chamber. They stopped. They did not bow. This was not in itself a violation. The protocol did not require bowing, but every species before them had bowed. It was simply what was done. The Inquisitors waited. We waited. The chamber held its long breath. Vascorlin spoke first, as was his right. His voice was thin and old and carried the weight of 3 centuries of judgments. He asked the ceremonial opening question in the Inquisitor's tongue, and Tomás Beltrán, the Bolivian linguist, answered the ritual acknowledgement in the same language, with a pronunciation so clean that two of the Inquisitors glanced at each other. This was noted. We wrote it down. Then Vascorlin asked the question that began every hearing, the question that had begun every hearing for 4,000 years. "Tell us about your God." Eliza Marwin did not answer. She set the wooden box down on the cold stone floor. She knelt beside it slowly, the way an older body kneels, with one hand on the floor for balance. She opened the box. From inside the box she removed a small metal kettle, a cloth bundle, and 7 small ceramic cups. She set them on the floor in a careful row. Then she looked up at the 7 Inquisitors, and she spoke for the first time, in plain galactic standard, in a voice so quiet that we had to lean forward to record it. "Please come down from your perches, sit with us. Let us have tea first." There is no word in our language for the silence that followed. The Inquisitors did not move. They could not. The protocol did not permit them to move. There was no precedent for what had been asked. Vascorlin's beak opened slightly and closed and opened again. The youngest of the 7, Inquisitor Henel of the Dravic, made a small sound in her throat that we could not identify. Tomás Beltrán knelt beside Eliza and unfolded the cloth he had carried. It was a simple woven mat, perhaps 2 meters across, in a soft blue pattern. He spread it carefully on the stone floor. He sat down on it cross-legged. He looked up at the Inquisitors. He waited. In our alcove we reached for the taxonomy. We did not know what else to do. We turned to the section on theological declarations. We searched for an entry that matched what was happening. There was none. We turned to the section on ceremonial preliminaries. There was none. We turned to the section on refusal of ritual, which contained 6 subcategories ranging from defiance to incoherence. None of them matched. The humans were not refusing the ritual. They were not defying it. They were doing something we had no word for. They were inviting the Inquisitors to be guests. It was Inquisitor Henel who moved first. She was the youngest of the 7, only 240 years old, ranked 6th in seniority, and she had always been considered slightly impulsive by the standards of her order. She climbed down from her perch. She walked slowly across the cold stone floor. The other 6 Inquisitors watched her in something that was not quite horror. She reached the mat. She looked down at it. She looked at Eliza. And then, after a hesitation that lasted perhaps 4 seconds, and would later be considered one of the most consequential pauses in the history of the conquered, she sat down. Eliza Marwin smiled at her. It was a small smile, the kind of smile we had seen in our observer reports under the heading of minor facial gesture, function unclear. She handed Inquisitor Henel one of the small ceramic cups. She poured tea into it from the kettle. The tea was pale and steamed gently. The smell reached our alcove. We will not pretend we did not notice. One by one, over the next several minutes, the other Inquisitors came down. Vascorlin came last, and he came stiffly, and we believe he came because he could not bear to be the only one still aloft. He sat on the mat with great difficulty. His old joints had not been folded in that position for over a century. Eliza handed him a cup. He took it. He did not drink. He simply held it, looking down into it, while the steam rose past his beak. For 3 hours no theology was spoken. We are required by the rules of our order to record this fact precisely. 3 hours and 11 minutes by the cathedral's central chronometer. During that time, Eliza Marwin and Tomás Beltrán served tea. They refilled cups. They asked the Inquisitors about small things, the kinds of things that we had never heard asked inside the chamber. They asked Inquisitor Henel about her home moon. They asked Vascorlin about his joints. They asked Inquisitor Velm of the Sarai whether she had eaten that morning. The Inquisitors, who had spent their adult lives interrogating others, did not know what to do with these questions. They answered them haltingly, and then with more ease, and after the first hour Inquisitor Velm laughed, very briefly, at something Tomás said, and then covered her mouth as if she had been caught at something shameful. We tried throughout this period to maintain the record. We were not successful. Our taxonomy has 14,006 entries. We opened it again and again. We searched for hospitality under religious customs. There was no such entry. We searched for tea under sacred substances. Tea was not classified. We searched for waiting under ritual phases. Waiting was a category, but only as a precursor to judgment, and what was happening in the chamber was not a precursor to anything. It was simply what was happening. We wrote in the margin of our record the words taxonomy insufficient. We had never written those words before. We have written them many times since. At one point during the second hour, Tomás Beltrán began, very quietly, to hum. It was a melody we did not recognize. The observer species delegate, a young Halen named Ierisav, who had been seated in the visitors' gallery and who was technically forbidden to participate in the ceremony, climbed down from her seat and walked to the edge of the mat. She did not sit. She did not ask permission. She simply stood there at the edge, listening to the humming, and after several minutes Eliza looked up and offered her the 8th cup, which we had not previously noticed had been brought. Ierisav took the cup. She sat. She would, in later years, describe that moment as the one in which her own species' history split into a before and an after, though she could not at the time have explained why. We watched Vascorlin most closely. We have known him for our entire professional life. We have recorded his judgments. We have lit lamps for the species he ranked at the bottom. He had not, in 3 centuries of presiding, ever shown what we would call distress. But during the 3rd hour, while Eliza was telling him a story about a small bird that had nested in the eaves of her childhood home, we observed that his eyes had filled with the clear fluid that his species produces in moments of overwhelming emotion. He did not wipe it away. He did not look away from her. He simply listened, holding the cup that he had still not drunk from, while a 600-year-old creature wept very quietly at a story about a bird. We do not know, even now, why he wept. He has never spoken of it. We have asked him once formally for the record, and he answered only that he had not been asked to sit down in a very long time. We wrote that answer in the archive. We light a small lamp for it on certain anniversaries, though we cannot say precisely what we are honoring. There was also the matter of Ierisav, the young Halen observer. She was 28 years old by her species reckoning, which is roughly the equivalent of human adolescence, and she had been sent to the cathedral as part of a junior diplomatic rotation that her people considered largely ceremonial. She was not supposed to do anything. She was supposed to watch and to return home and to write a report that nobody would read. Instead, she broke ritual accepted tea and sat on a human mat in the middle of the most sacred chamber in the galaxy. Her own delegation was horrified. Her own species council convened an emergency session. Ierisav was recalled in disgrace. 6 years later, she would be elected to that same council on a platform that consisted of 3 words in her own language, which translate roughly to offer the cup. She is, at the time of this writing, the longest-serving member of the Assembly of Worlds. She has never spoken publicly about what happened inside the cathedral. She does not need to. Every delegate who meets with her is, by long-standing custom, offered tea before any business is conducted. And there was, finally, the matter of ourselves. We are required by the rules of our order to remain in the alcove. We are not permitted to step onto the chamber floor. We are not permitted to speak during a hearing. We are, in the most literal sense, furniture, a function of the room, not a participant in it. We have observed this rule for the entirety of our service. We have observed it through hearings that moved us. We have observed it through judgments we considered unjust. We have observed it because the rule is older than we are, and because we are scribes, and because scribes do not participate. During the 3rd hour, Eliza Marwin looked up from the mat. She looked directly at our alcove. We do not know how she knew we were there. The alcove is shadowed and our order wears dark robes, and visitors to the chamber are not, as a rule, made aware of our presence. But she looked at us, and she smiled the small smile, and she lifted one of the ceramic cups slightly in our direction, in what was unmistakably an offer. We did not move. We could not move. The rule was older than we were. She held the cup up for perhaps 3 seconds. Then she set it down on the edge of the mat in our direction and turned back to the conversation. She did not look at us again. The cup sat there for the remainder of the hearing. We watched it. The steam rose from it for some time, and then it stopped rising, and the tea grew cold, and still the cup sat there. We are not going to record what we did at the end of the hearing. There are some things that the scribe does not write down even about himself. We will say only that the cup did not remain on the mat. We will say only that there are now, in the great vaulted archive at the moon's core, certain entries written in a slightly unsteady hand. We will say only that the rule that scribes do not participate has not been the same rule, in our private understanding, since that afternoon. The hearing ended without a ranking. This was, in itself, unprecedented. Every hearing in the 4,000-year history of the cathedral had ended with a ranking. The taxonomy required it. The Concord required it. The architecture of the chamber itself, with its great brass ranking bell at the rear wall, required it. But Vas Corlin, when he finally rose from the mat, with great difficulty and with the cup still untouched in his hand, did not ring the bell. He looked at the other 6 inquisitors. He looked at the humans, he looked at the bell, and then he simply walked out of the chamber. The other inquisitors followed. The humans gathered their cups and their kettle and their mat. They left through the visitor's door. The chamber was empty by the 3rd hour and the 47th minute. We sat in our alcove for a very long time after they had gone. In the year that followed, the concord of certain faiths began to come apart. The collapse was not dramatic. There were no rebellions, no fleets, no formal denunciations. There was only a slow withdrawal of consent. Inquisitor Hennel of the Dravik resigned her seat within 30 days of the hearing and returned to her home moon, where she opened, of all things, a small establishment that served hot beverages to travelers. She refused all interviews. She is said to be content. Inquisitor Velm of the Sarai followed her 3 months later. Vas Corlin lasted longer. But he never presided over another hearing. He sat at his perch through 12 more ceremonies, and then, on the morning of the 13th, did not come down to the chamber. He sent word that he was no longer certain he had the standing to ask the question. By the end of the 2nd year, 3 of the 7 inquisitor species had withdrawn from the Concord entirely. By the end of the 5th, the taxonomy had been formally suspended. By the end of the 10th, the ranking bell at the rear of the chamber had been removed, not by decree but simply by quiet agreement, and placed in the archive among the artifacts of obsolete ritual. The hollow cathedral remained. It was too old and too holy to be abandoned, but what happened inside it was no longer a hearing. It was something for which the galaxy is still developing the vocabulary. Humanity, in the meantime, did almost nothing. They did not press their advantage. They did not seek new trade routes. They did not demand the high rankings they could now have claimed. Ambassador Eliza Marwin returned to Wales, where she resumed what her file described as small, unremarkable duties at a hospice on the coast. She declined all honors. She gave one interview to a small regional broadcaster in which she said only that she had been very tired during the hearing and had wanted to sit down. Tomás Beltrán returned to Bolivia and continued his linguistic work. He is said to be writing a dictionary of the Inquisitors' ceremonial language, for which there is no commercial market. Neither of them, to our knowledge, has ever spoken publicly about what they did in the chamber. They behave as if they had done nothing remarkable. We have come to believe that they consider this to be true. The hollow cathedral of Tesarvin still stands. It is in many ways unchanged. The benches are still swept. The perches are still polished, though they are no longer used for their original purpose. The great central floor is still washed and dried before each gathering. But there is now, at the threshold of the chamber, a small alcove where visitors are seated upon arrival, and where they are offered, by long custom and by formal protocol, a hot drink before any conversation begins. The drink is not always tea. Different species prefer different things, but the principle is the same. No question is asked of a guest until the guest has been seated and warmed and given something to hold. We have been the keepers of the record for a very long time. We have written down hearings that ended in glory and hearings that ended in ruin. We have lit lamps for the species that no longer exist, and we have filed the transcripts of the ones who do. We thought, when we began our service, that we were preserving the wisdom of the galaxy. We understand now that we were only preserving a particular kind of question. The humans asked a different question, and they asked it without speaking, and we have spent the rest of our service trying to write that question down. We have not succeeded. Our taxonomy still does not have an entry for what happened in the chamber that day. We have proposed several. None of them have held. The closest we have come is a phrase in our own old language that does not translate well into galactic standard but means, very roughly, the God who pours. It is not, we suspect, what the humans would have called it. They did not seem to feel the need to call it anything at all. There is a thing we have learned in the long years since that we did not know before. We had believed all our lives that theology was a matter of what a species said about the ultimate. We had built our entire taxonomy on this belief. We had ranked civilizations by the elegance of their answers. But the humans did not give an answer. They gave a kettle and a mat and a small ceramic cup, and they offered these things to 7 inquisitors who had never been offered anything in their lives. And the chamber, which had stood for 4,000 years on the strength of a single question, could not survive the answer they gave. We light a lamp for them on certain anniversaries in the archive at the moon's core. We do not know what god, if any, they worshipped. We do not know if Eliza Marwin prayed, or if Tomás Beltrán believed in anything beyond the language he loved. We have decided that this is not our business. They were not, in the end, asked to tell us about their God. They were asked, and they declined the asking, and what they offered instead was something the galaxy is still learning how to receive. They asked us about our God. We asked them to sit down first, and we are still, all these years later, trying to understand the answer they gave us.